Deal. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Now we can rock and roll here. All right, so we were talking about the color management topic. Again, the ongoing discussion we've been having about basically our deliverables and how we can ensure to the very best of our ability that we are creating the best possible viewing experience for the greatest number of viewers, and of course defining best as the closest possible reproduction of what we all signed off on when we graded the piece in our controlled environment in Rec 709 Gamma 24 or whatever we graded in. So I am happy to report that I've yet to completely crack the code, and I was just telling Gadali I've got a growing spreadsheet where I'm trying to isolate and identify all the variables and the way they behave. But I want to show you guys kind of the latest and the greatest here. So I'm going to talk about one particular corner of this issue that selfishly is like most applicable to me. So this is where I decided to start. I decided to start with a couple things. First of all, I've noticed that this reproduction issue, as we've been talking about it in terms of like, gosh, my deliverable doesn't quite match out there in the wild what I saw when I mastered the image. There's a couple variables that recur for me in terms of what that mismatch is. The first one is one that we've already talked about. It's a gamma mismatch. It feels a little thinner, a little more open when I'm looking at it in something like Frame.io. So the testing that I've done has been about trying to get a better gamma or 1D contrast curve alignment within Frame.io on Chrome on a Mac. So quite narrow right now. And some of the findings that I have, I'm very confident are going to translate out into other applications, but that was my sort of testing application that I'm going to share with you guys today. So there's an interesting feature. One of the other reasons that I chose to do this for Mac is because there's an actually great feature that's probably a bug in its initial source. But if I'm in Mac OS and I take a screenshot, as many of us have probably done, if I take that screenshot in Mac OS, it's not just going to capture the RGB pixels that were being sent to the monitor at that time. It's actually going to capture what color sync, the OS level color management in Mac OS, did to that image in order to prepare it for our display. So that means that, like in my testing environment on a vanilla MacBook Pro that is set up to a generic sRGB profile, if I take a screenshot within something like Chrome of a ramp on Frame.io, I'm actually going to see what is being done to that ramp by the color management itself. So let's go over to my second timeline here. And you guys can see I've got Mac OS, MacBook Pro, 111 and 121. And we talked about tags in our last two episodes. So I'll point you guys to those if you don't know what the hell I'm talking about there. But basically, the first thing to demonstrate is that these both match. So when I take a pure linear ramp, what this shape you see here on the waveform is, what it started as was this right here. It started as a pure linear ramp, okay? So by the time I export that into a QuickTime, upload that QuickTime to Frame.io, load it up in Chrome on my MacBook Pro, and take a screenshot, I'm being shown the entire net of that journey, including the manipulations that were done to that curve by macOS's color sync feature. And I just want to point out, on Windows, this isn't the case. If I take a screenshot in Windows, it's not going to cook in the transformations that it applied when it was preparing that image for display on the particular monitor I was viewing it on, which is actually probably the better thing for any application except ours, where I actually am really glad that that exists, because without that on Mac OS, like what I'm going to have to do next is actually get a probe in here and actually probe the monitor itself so that I can get that same data. And then the problem becomes we have the monitor itself as another variable in the mix. So I wish to all hell, and I'm actually still looking for a possible way that I could capture a screenshot in Windows and on iOS, because iOS doesn't do what I'm describing in Mac OS either. I wish like crazy that I could capture a screenshot in those operating systems that would show me what was done to the image in order to prepare it for a generic sRGB reproduction. But so far, don't know a way to do that. So within Mac OS, there is this mechanism that's built in, probably a bug, but super useful for us. So that's what happens to this image via that round trip, is this right here. And I can confirm to you guys that upstream of that final transformation from getting the image to properly reproduce on an sRGB monitor, the color sync transformation that's happening, this linear ramp is preserved. So this is what my MacBook Pro is doing, and I have a hunch is going to be a similar thing to what my Windows OS and my iOS will do, but I have no way of confirming that yet, so I can't speak to it just yet. But at a minimum, this is a objective measurement for me of, okay, this is exactly like what I've been identifying for a long time, what I summarized a minute ago of like, gosh, why does everything feel just a little bit more open by the time I'm viewing it in Frame.io compared to how it looked in the suite? I can see that reflected here because that's what's being done to the curve. So all we have to do from that point is come up with a counter move in order to get a neutral reproduction. So let me see where, there we go. Here's my web viewing correction. So if
and we can't see your screen right now.
Oh, whoops. I'll back up there just a little bit. So let's see here. There we go. So just re-summarizing what I was talking about a moment ago. I have two assets here. One was encoded. They're both pure linear ramps that were encoded with no color management. One is one that was encoded with 111, and one is one that was encoded with 121 gamut or encoding tags. And first thing to observe here is the difference between these two is 0. So Frame.io is not paying attention to those tags, and those tags are not being then broadcast back out by Frame.io or by Chrome. They're basically, other than in local instances, like when we're viewing in QuickTime, these tags actually are not making a difference to at least Frame.io. And I can confirm in initial tests that seems to be the case with Vimeo and YouTube as well, at least on my Mac in Chrome. A lot of variables. So that's kind of data point number one. And what I was saying a moment ago when I thought I was sharing my screen is if I look at my waveform here, this is what that linear ramp initially was. And by the time it makes it all the way out to reproduction, this is what has happened to it. And furthermore, this is happening in between Frame.io properly sending out a pure linear ramp still. So everything is still simpatico and good at that point. What's happening here, we are seeing only what macOS's color sync, color management is doing to the image. And roughly speaking, it looks to me like it is trying to compensate for a Rec 709 image. Boy, am I still live over here? Looks like my feed is dead. I hope I'm still alive. You can.
I'm seeing you. Your face looks frozen.
Well, we can't have that. How about are we seeing
your screen is moving. Okay. I can see you changing programs.
Okay, hang tight one sec, guys. Boy, it's a red letter day. I think I'm now back alive now. Okay, so what I was saying is it looks to me, roughly speaking, that we're seeing a pretty reasonable adjustment for it. It seems like ColorSync is trying to adjust for a Gamma 2.4 to get it to reproduce properly on a sRGB Gamma. So that's roughly kind of what we're looking at here. But what I was showing a moment ago is the following. So if we look at this shift and we say this is what's happening, at least as a result of the color management in macOS, I can't yet speak to iOS or Windows, we can then pretty easily derive a correction that I can put on before I output this file. So this isn't perfect, but it's pretty darn good. And if I apply this to my file before I render it out, then I will end up with a net of a linear curve that looks like it originally did back inside of my controlled Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 environment. So it's basically a way of saying if our goal is we want to reproduce what we are seeing in our grading environment one-to-one out there in the real world, meaning that a linear ramp inside of our grading environment is going to reproduce a perceptually linear ramp in Frame.io on Chrome within macOS. A correction like this will do it because I've been able to actually profile what that system is doing to that linear ramp and then simply counter it preemptively with this LUT that I would apply at the very end of my signal chain just for web deliverables. And my hope is that this correction can become one that's sort of evergreen and that works not only for Mac, but for iOS and for Windows as well, and is basically a correction for reproduction in Chrome of Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 deliverables out there in the real world. And so more research to be done there. I'll keep you guys posted. And this doesn't even touch on the topic of viewing conditions, because just because I am doing an absolute preservation of my linearity, that doesn't mean it will look and feel the same. And there may actually be things that we want to do above and beyond neutrally reproducing what we saw in the grading suite in order to get a better perceptual match. But the foundation of that has to be getting a good absolute literal match. And then on top of that, namely, it's a question of saying like, all right, well, what is my viewing surround and how can I compensate for that? Because as you guys may know, if I'm looking at an image if I'm looking at the exact same monitor, exact same calibrated display inside of a dark grading environment, and then I pull that display off of the wall and I bring it into my living room and there's daylight pouring in and I plug it in there and I run the same signal to it, I will not see perceptually the same image. Things will have changed. So compensating for those things is another subject entirely, but it's plenty to bite off, as those of us know who've been talking about this for a couple weeks now. It's plenty to bite off initially just to try to solve the riddle of like, how do I get a one-to-one accurate reproduction of what I saw in the grading suite on the other screens that I'm viewing my content on, and then we can continue to refine and make viewing surround adaptations from there with that foundation of a properly, like a absolutely reproduced image. So that's the latest and greatest news from the front. I can answer some questions about that before we talk about other things, if anybody has any.
Jim is asking, what happens when the correction is applied to something that doesn't require it?
Bad things. When the correction is applied to something that doesn't require it, you would get this essentially. So if it's being applied to a linear ramp and it's going into a system that does not do this, if that makes sense, what will happen is the correction will do that. It will give you the exact opposite problem of what we were initially trying to solve, which is it feeling a little thin, a little bit open in the middle. It's going to feel a little bit heavy and actually a little bit, you can see the main two ingredients here are an overall kind of like gamma drop with a little bit of a toe opening. So that's what we will, if we don't apply that to a system that has that baked in offset downstream, then we're just going to be left with the actual dip in gamma and that little bit of opening in the toe.
And also related from Mad, which ICC profile is used if color sync is kicking in? And he says he assumes that standard ICC profiles for the corresponding tag, or if it's not one of the calibrated ICC profiles.
Correct. So it's not a calibrated ICC profile. It is the generic sRGB, whose name escapes me because I've been bouncing between different color management. But if you look here, like in my system settings, this is what it looks like on this. You guys are seeing a Dell external display, which I did this on the screen of the MacBook itself, but same principle here. So I'm using, it's like basic sRGB profile is what it's called. So it's literally just targeting without any compensation for unique characteristics or assumed unique characteristics of the particular display. It's just assuming a display that perfectly reproduces basic sRGB, or sRGB, I should say, and targeting those characteristics with the color sync transformation. So the idea is that while no display is, like all displays are going to be a little north or south or east or west of perfectly reproducing sRGB, that is the presumptive standard out there. So if we, at least on the Mac side, if we are looking at what color sync does in terms of targeting sRGB, then we are getting a meaningful representation of what the bullseye is going to be out there with all these displays kind of plotting somewhere around that center point, if that makes sense.
Cool. I think that's all the questions on that. So we can move on to Long Dancer, who's asking about the approach to node-based color management and how do you use this approach in either the pre-clip, post-clip, or timeline level?
Yeah, for sure. So let's kind of do a fresh lap through that because I've talked about it before, but things have moved around a little bit in Resolve, I think, since the last time I did. And my workflow is always changing as well. So let's talk about it here. This is actually a good example, this timeline that I'm in right now. So right now, the color management that I am choosing to use is I have some red media and I have some airy media, but I actually am using Airy Log C as my working color space. I could be using DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. I could be using ACES CCT. As you guys know, our working color space actually doesn't mean much at the end of the day. All that we really require for a good working color space is a sufficiently large color volume and a sufficiently large dynamic range, and the ability to easily map into that working color space from whatever our source color space may be, as well as the ability to easily map out to a display spec from that color space. So there's lots and lots of color spaces that hit that standard. And without going on to a whole tangent, let me just point out, like here within Resolve Color Management, if I do a custom, I can actually pick any of these color spaces as my what Resolve Color Management calls the timeline color space, or what I would call a working color space. I can choose from any of these. Now, these are not all good candidates. There's many that would not be, but basically any of these that are log containers with a sufficiently large set of RGB primaries are going to be a fine working color space, and you're actually never going to know the difference. So if I were to be working in Airy Log C versus DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, if the rest of my pipeline is sound and equivalent, then you'll never know the difference. It's just a question of what my tools and what my LUTs are built for and where my hands are most comfortable as an artist. So I'm going to leave my DaVinci YRGB color science turned on here. I'm going to flip my timeline color space to Airy Log C, and we're going to explain exactly the three things that this setting affects in just a moment, and it's not the things that you might expect. But I'm going to leave this set up here. And all of this means with color science set to DaVinci YRGB, this does not necessarily mean uncolor managed, because I'm going to be color managing in this project, as we'll see. What it means is Resolve, don't do anything with color management. I will take care of the color management. Do not input transform, do not output transform. Make no assumptions about what I need to do in terms of my overall imaging pipeline. I got this. I'm going to do the whole thing. And that's exactly what I want to do here. And this is the foundation of the node-based color management workflow that we're talking about. So I have two different types of media in here. I have red and I have airy. And so the first step, before I even get into the output transform in terms of reproducing things accurately on my display, targeting my display spec, I want to get everything mapped into my common working space. One of the reasons that I use Airy Log C is because a lot of the media that I grade already is Airy Log C. So in those cases, I actually don't even do anything to get into my working color space. I'm just there already. And in the case of media like this, I've got these red shots that I do indeed need to map into Airy Log C before I go downstream and worry about my output transform to Rec 709, because I want to do things in sequence. I want to start by getting everything input mapped into my working color space, and then I will worry about getting out to my display color space. So in terms of that input mapping, I'm just using a Resolve color space transform, red wide gamut RGB, red log 3G10, into Airy Alexa, Airy Log C. I'm doing no tone mapping and no gamut mapping because I shouldn't need to do those things if I'm going from one high volume, wide dynamic range color space into another. Those things should all be left off. I shouldn't need to resort to those things. These features are both about fitting wider dynamic range into smaller, or vice versa, and fitting bigger color volume into smaller color volume, or vice versa. And since these two spaces are not dramatically different from one another, I don't need to do those things. And in fact, I don't want to do those things because it's just going to complicate the processing of my image, and I want to process things as simply as I possibly can. And the only other thing I'll mention here with this red media is there's a couple of gotchas when you're doing the node-based color management solution. And I'm going to talk about in a minute the positives and why I like to do a node-based color management solution. But there are a couple of gotchas that we really want to underline and emphasize. The first one is this. If I set up color management inside of Resolve Color Management, or if I go to my color management settings, if I do any color management setup here in my project settings, One of the nice things about doing that here is that any of my raw formats, so things like R3D, like we have here, or Airy Raw or Blackmagic Raw, Resolve is going to be smart enough to say, oh, okay, well, I know from looking at my project settings that we're doing an ACES thing, so I'm actually going to direct... Oh my goodness. Did you guys lose me for a second?
I just saw the YouTube screen reloading for a second, but it looks like we're okay right now.
Okay, man. I must not be living right,
It's Friday the 13th.
Yeah, seriously.
Something's going on.
Is it actually Friday the 13th?
It is.
Oh, hey, I mean, there's our scientific explanation.
Yeah.
Okay, debayering red. So when we set up our color management in our project settings, the debayer is going to be handled automatically on our behalf. It's automatically going to debayer any raw format right into our working space. No tweaking or adjustment needed. And in fact, we can't even change that stuff. No matter what settings we do within our camera raw, it's going to do its own thing. So it's going to say, hey, you told me to handle the color management. Let me handle the color management. In my case, because I'm doing things in nodes, what I do here in my camera raw settings actually matters quite a bit, because this is going to be the state of debayered image that I am feeding into the head of my node graph for a shot like this one. So what I've done here is I've set my color science to IPP2. Actually, even upstream of that, I've told Resolve, don't decode using camera metadata, because they were probably monitoring using like red gamma 4 or some sort of display color space. Don't decode using whatever the operator used. Decode using what I tell you. So I do project, color science IPP2, color space, red, wide gamut RGB, gamma curve log3G10, which are the stock color gamut and tone curve for the IPP2 color system. So we're now debayering into that. I actually shouldn't decode at 1/8 res good. I'm going to do half res premium there, 16-bit depth. And then I'm going to tell it, hey, whatever the operator set their ISO and their color temperature to, I want you to pay attention to that and debayer accordingly. So with that set up, I can now apply a single color space transform that's going to take me from my input color space to my working color space. There we go. I was wondering why I wasn't seeing that update. So you can see that changing now. And so now that's the front end. I've got everything here in my timeline mapped into Airy log C, because all this stuff already is Airy log C, and the only stuff that's not, I've now successfully mapped into Airy log C using that color space transform for the red material specifically. And now all we need to worry about, and by the way, if I wanted to, in terms of organization, what I might choose to do, and what I've talked about before, is I might choose to make a group. If I'm not already using groups for some other purpose in my workflow, I might say, I'm going to make a group and I'm going to call it red. And this is going to be the group all of my red stuff will live in. And instead of doing my input transform from red, wide gamut RGB log3G10 to Airy Alexa log C at the clip level, I'm actually going to delete it here at the clip level and stick it in at the group pre-clip level, so that the moment any clip is invited into this party, it is automatically going to receive that input transform as its very first transformation upstream of anything else at the group pre-clip level, which of course means that it will be upstream of anything at the clip level, because if I turn off my OpenFX and you look at my 4 dots, which indicate group pre-clip, clip, group post-clip, and timeline, that is representing a linear movement from left to right. So if I want to get to the absolute head furthest upstream I can get in my node graph, that would be by going to node 1 in my group pre-clip. Next from there would be my clip level. Next from there would be group post-clip, and finally would be my timeline level. So that's sort of like the order of operations in terms of our different sections of our node graph when we're using groups, and in general with clip. Even when we don't have groups, clip comes first and then timeline, as you guys may know. So we're input mapped from red into Airy log C. Our Airy log C stuff is already in Airy log C, of course. And now we just need to worry about our output transform. And this is the first place where I can touch on sort of liking the flexibility of node-based color management, because as you guys have heard me talk about before, there are actually multiple valid solutions to how do we get from 10,000 nits of dynamic range and a color volume that's this big down to 100 nits of dynamic range and a color volume that's that big. There's more than one solution to that problem, because it is a subjective solution that we are seeking. We are seeking the best possible reproduction of all of that color information captured by the camera, but with the constraint that we are targeting a display which cannot nearly reproduce all of that dynamic range and color. So there's always going to be one part image science and one part subjective engineering, I would call it, where we're trying to figure out, okay, what is a reasonable way to reproduce everything that we can inside of this container in a way that feels pleasing and feels like it has a meaningful relationship with what was originally captured in this higher color volume, wider dynamic range. So one of the reasons that I like working in node-based color management is there's more than one solution to that challenge. And just to walk you through a couple of them here, I can use Aries' solution to this, which looks like that. I could use Red's solution to this, which looks like that. I could use Resolve Color Management's solution to this, which looks like that. So none of them are a world away. It's not like one is 5 stops blown past the other, but they all have slightly different character and are going to give you different starting points. I could also use the ACES solution to this problem. If I wanted to go to, in that case, I would do it in 2 steps. I would take my Aries C working space and I would transform into, actually even better, I would do this like so. I would do it all with ACES transforms. So I would go from Alexa into ACES linear to get into something that, actually I don't even need to do that. I'm making things too complicated. I can do it in one single transform. Here would be Aries, or excuse me, the ACES solution to the problem, which looks different from the others, as you can see. So all slightly different solutions to the same problem, but that's one of the reasons why I like working in node-based color management is I'll say that I have defaults, but you guys can see I have this Powergrade folder here of all these different outputs because I will audition through all of them when I'm working on a new project. And sometimes I'll even do it with clients in the room and be like, hey, let's just talk about our baseline kind of stock display prep. Which of these feels best for you in terms of overall contrast level and overall sort of like colorfulness and saturation and the way that different colors are being parked. So it's not really, it's tricky because you wouldn't really think of this or call it a look per se, but it is influencing the appearance of your image. So if you can pick out an output transform that is more aligned with your creative vision for the project, that's that much less work you need to do at your look level and even less work that you need to do at the individual clip level. So it's kind of a variable that I play with a lot in between projects. So that's one of the reasons that I like to use node-based color management. The other reason that you guys have heard me talk about before is I like to have explicit visible access to my imaging pipeline. Like, to me, the number one benefit and the number one con of doing color management here, it's one and the same. Because the benefit of color managing here is that when I turn this on, like let me just audition for this for us. I'm going to turn off everything that I've got on this current clip, and I'm going to switch myself over to DaVinci Wire GB Color Managed, and we'll do the DaVinci Wide Gamut preset and tell it I want to output Rec 709 Gamma 24. And then within this model, I just need to tell Resolve Color Management I'm using Aries C, which it looks like I already have. So that's all cool because I don't need any nodes in order to get sound color management, and all of the image pipeline and color management is happening under the hood. You could think of that as a pro because it's giving you a nice foundation to work on top of. But for me, it's also the biggest con because I actually want to see all the links in that chain so that I can control it and tweak it and modify it as needed. And I even will have, some particular shots that are, if they're problematic, I will pull them completely out of the stack. And for that reason, like I sometimes will choose to do my output transform at the group post clip level, as opposed to at the timeline level, so that I can have a group, like if we did that on this shot, for example, let's go here, add into a new group. We'll call this, I don't know, my Airy. And I'm just going to stick this 709 output into my group post clip like so. And then I'll just completely wipe out my timeline. And what this will allow me to do is if I'm ever really in a jam and I've got a really delicate or misbehaving piece of footage, or I don't know, let me turn off that project level color management now. If I've ever got a really misbehaving clip or I don't know its color space or no color mapping seems to work and I have to go like full manual and just kind of knob and feel my way through it, at any point, all I have to do is take a clip out of whatever group I put it into. And now, like with this clip, for example, nothing is happening to it because everything that does happen to it is married to one or more of the groups that I've set up. But unlike with Resolve Color Management or any color management set up in the project settings where I could bypass my color management, I suppose. But I prefer to just have the ability to just yank things out of the stack completely visually and be able to see, just as I can see here, oh, okay, so it's coming in as area and it's being mapped out to 709. I can visually see here without needing to look at my context menu. Oh, okay, so it's coming in whatever state it's in and nothing's happening to it because I can see there are no nodes or transformations happening anywhere in my pipeline. So that's kind of a refresher on the node-based color management thing. And I feel like I had one thing I wanted to wrap that up with, but it's escaping me at the moment, so I'll put it to any questions we have.
Heinz is asking about one of the changes in Resolve 17 label anyway. What is the new CSC ACES CCT setting? What does that mean?
It means you have to scroll more. That's literally it. Like CSC stands for color space conversion. Why they adopted that convention, I'm not sure. I don't know if that puts it more into alignment with the designations made by the Academy, but what it means is that you have to scroll more, which drives me a little bit crazy because these are probably the three options that I select most commonly when I'm using ACES transforms. So now instead of being at the very top, they're at the very bottom, and I'm not psyched about it.
All right. And Tori is asking, saying, I remembered you mentioned ACES leaves about 10% of the color science to the camera manufacturer. Do you ever just work in Aerylog as the working space for preferential color?
Yeah, I mean, I often work in Aerylog C. I mean, I'll say this, like, if I said that about ACES, it wasn't really specific to ACES. Like, all of the pretty much any color science we're going to use in any color management framework, it's dependent on the self-reporting of the manufacturer. So like in this example, even though I'm not using ACES and like, you know, I'm using this ARRI to 709 transformation, this transform actually happens to be made by ARRI. But even if I weren't using ARRIs, if I were using Resolve Color Management, the foundation of this transformation is the furnished data on the primary's end tone curve of an ARRI Alexa sensor and what it captures. So it's all dependent on the self-reporting of these manufacturers. And generally, like, I don't see a like world of problem with those things like, oh, that's way off from the actual characteristic of the camera. But I would say like ACES is no more or less reliable in that regard than any other color management framework or any furnished manufacturer data, which is going to be the foundation of any good color management framework. It's all going to be based on that stuff. There's not going to be, you know, if we really wanted to, if I wanted to make an experiment of it and go out and shoot 10 different Alexas under tightly controlled testing conditions and measure their response compared to like a linear XYZ color space, I could do that, and I might find that I had a more robust and more accurate profile than what Aerylog C, ARRI wide color gamut describes, or not. But short of doing that, we kind of have to go off of the manufacturer's word for it, regardless of whether we're in ACES or any other system.
All right. Rotu is asking, how do you convert and export to P3 after having graded in Rec 709?
Yeah, good question. So that would, of course, depend on how we are color managing. If we are taking the optimal solution, we could simply, like if we were doing targeted color management, we could simply change our output transform. And instead of doing, I don't even need that second transform. I'm going to simplify this here. So instead of doing a 709 transform here, if we were doing for like a theatrical deliverable, shall we say, so P3 DCI, gamma 2.6 with a peak output of 48, which is not going to look correct on my display, but this is the spec that, at least as spec that you could be theoretically being asked to furnish for a DCP, for example. It would literally just be a matter of changing these things. And then you would definitely want to see this image reproduced on the display that it is targeting now and confirm like, okay, it looks and feels the same shot by shot. You'd want to do a trim pass to make sure that subjectively things aren't moving. But in terms of good color science, that's really all there would be to it if we had used good color management up until then. If we hadn't, let's look at, kind of option number 2. Let's say that if instead of having color management where we can just toggle our output like I just did, let's say that all we have, I'm just going to go to my timeline level to help visualize this and say like, all I've got is this 709 master right here. I can't get upstream. I can't disable the output transform. I'm stuck with a 709 master that I simply need to remap for a P3, like a DCP deliverable. I can do a similar thing here with pretty good results. The only catch here is that the color primaries of Rec. 709 are actually a little smaller than those of P3, maybe more than a little bit, not like night and day, but significantly, I would say. So we're going to have to be sort of exploding things back out to P3 with color information that is not fully sufficient to do that because it's already been choked into that smaller color volume. But it's still a very, basically you're going to be a little bit limited by the fact that you're starting from Rec. 709, but you can still get great looking results doing that. And I've done this before for more than one grade. So what we would want to do here is something like this, where we are starting with a 100 nit Rec. 709 gamma 24 source, and we are mapping into P3 DCI gamma 26 48 nit. And then our gamut mapping, we could probably safely leave off because we're going from a smaller to a larger gamut as opposed to the other way around. And that would look like this. And this is very similar to what I just did here at the group post clip level. Again, the only difference is that in example number 1, I'm starting from a massive unified working color space with way more dynamic range and, more importantly, way more color volume than I ultimately am going to need for that P3 DCI DCP deliverable. Whereas in this case, I'm starting with a dynamic range and a color volume where the dynamic range is sufficient, but the color volume is actually a little smaller than the color volume that I need for that deliverable. So we can compensate and make a best fit of it in terms of using good image science, but we're going to get slightly different results because we are having to sort of like stretch out that smaller color volume to fit over the larger color volume, as opposed to example number 1, where it's all just a question of, well, are we down mapping all the way to 7 or 9 or slightly less so to P3 DCI, if that makes sense.
Okay. Joanna is asking, can you show the Resolve tools to adjust exposure, Kelvin, contrast, etc., as opposed to your custom tools?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you guys the caveat that if you could do all those things perfectly in Resolve and in a one-to-one manner to what my tools do, then I wouldn't have bothered to spend a couple hundred hours making those tools, but you can get really close. So I'll show you guys what you can do within Resolve. So first up, let's talk about exposure. So exposure, we sort of have 2 options for within Resolve. The simplest way to adjust exposure that's going to get you very, very close is going to be offset, assuming we are in a log space. If you're not in a log space, if you're in a gamma space, you need to get into a log space because you're going to have trouble regardless. You need to get out into a more scene-referred, more grading-friendly working space and out of that display-referred grading space. But assuming we are in a log space, we can use offset and we can get a very exposure-like response. It will not be identical, but it will be very close. And then the even better option that became available to us in Resolve 17 is here in the HDR zones palette using the exposure, the global exposure knob down here. Now, this actually brings me back to something I forgot about earlier, which was exactly what I wanted to round out our conversation about node-based color management on, which is this. So we're going to take a quick detour and then come right back to the HDR palette. I talked for a moment, I left you guys on a geek cliffhanger of like, okay, what are the 3 things that this setting, timeline color space, affects? What are the 3 things inside of Resolve that it affects? One of them is the behavior of the high dynamic range palette. So you guys might have seen when we started our conversation today, I was on the default timeline color space of Rec. 709 scene. And you guys can see if I reset everything in my HDR palette, and let's just do something extreme. Let's go like way hot on exposure for a second. Beautiful image, right? If I go back to my project settings and I change my timeline color space to Arialog C, let's look at what happens to this image when I hit save. It changes, right? Because all of the tools and knobs here inside of the high dynamic range palette are what we call color space aware, meaning that in addition to whatever math is driving the exposure slider here inside of the high dynamic range palette, there's that operation, but it is sandwiched in between two bookending operations that are taking working color space and moving it into what's called the LMS color space, which is a perceptually uniform color space that's useful for things like adjusting color temperature and adjustment. Then it's applying its math inside of that color space. And then there's another bookend on the other side to kick you right back out to your original working color space. So that bookend itself has a net effect of nothing. If you were just to put those bookends on either side of no operation, you would see no change. You're simply walking into the adjacent room and then you're walking back into the room you started in. So no net change there, but you are changing the behavior of the math that is happening in between. So that's what's happening here. When I switch from Rec 709 scene to Arialog C, instead of the overall pipeline here being Arialog C to LMS, adjust exposure, and then LMS back to Arialog C, in Rec 709 scene a moment ago, the pipeline is actually Rec 709 scene to LMS, make the operation, and then LMS back to Rec 709 scene. And so we were getting less desirable and, in fact, non-accurate, not photometrically valid results when we were set up here because we were providing the wrong information to the high dynamic range palette, which needs that information in order to operate correctly because all of its tools are premised on the idea of color space awareness and of being able to move from whatever color space the colorist is feeding me into my color space that works best for my agenda as the HDR zones palette, make my adjustments there, and then I'll give back the colorist what they gave me. But in order to make those adjustments properly, it needs accurate information of what your working color space is. So that is one of the three variables that I mentioned earlier in terms of node-based color management that this setting will have effect on. And because I don't want to get too far derailed from the question we're on, I'll leave off those other two, but someone remind me if I forget, we'll talk about the other two before we're done today. And in the meanwhile, if anybody has guesses that they want to throw into the chat, certainly feel free. So back to the question at hand in terms of adjusting exposure, Kelvin, getting close to what you can do with my tools, my Colloid tools inside of Resolve. This is going to be your best bet for exposure. It's closer. It is still not exactly photometric exposure, which is why I still have an exposure tool, but it is very, very close, and I wouldn't be shy about using it as a next best option. Next up, Kelvin. Kelvin is going to work the exact same way. We can use temperature here inside of the high dynamic range palette in order to get photometrically accurate color temperature adjustment. And I hope everyone understands what I mean when I say photometrically accurate. I mean, in the case of exposure, I expect that if I add 0.5 here, this is the exact same thing as if I were to go from an f5.6 to halfway to an f4, for example. Or if I were to make an easier example, exposure plus 1. This should be the exact same thing. If you're going to call it exposure, in my opinion, it should be the exact same thing as if I were to move from a 5.6 to a 4. If it's not, what the hell is the point of calling it exposure? Call it arbitrary degree of brightness. You know, like if you're going to use photographic terms, it should have a photometrically accurate behavior. And same thing with temperature. So if I go down here to the temperature knob, this is set up to be photometrically accurate. So I should be getting, if I do 1,000 degrees here, I should be getting very, very similar results to what I would get if I had re-rated my camera in by 1,000 degrees on the day that I shot this particular image, if I had been the one to shoot it. So that's the idea there, is we're getting these photometrically accurate adjustments. That was the motivation behind my initial round of colloid tools. And actually, I'll point out that while I've maintained my exposure tool, because this one still isn't quite nailing it, I've actually discontinued the Kelvin tool because this is a perfectly viable alternative to it, and there's really no reason to have a third-party tool if there's a tool that does the job right inside of Resolve. So that's one that you actually are not making any compromise on at all. This is actually the best solution in this case. And the only other solution I would throw out that you might get slightly more accurate results on would be to use chromatic adaptation. So if you know, hypothetical example, let's say in the case of a shot like this, I'm going to set my illuminant type for both source and target to color temperature. And I'm going to say that I have a target of 5600. And let's say that I know that that there was an offset in my light source, for example, that while my light source was supposed to be 5600, I realized, oh man, I was adult. I left a full CTO over my key light, meaning that my key light was effectively moved down to 3200 Kelvin. And if I wanted to make a really, really tight compensation for that using the information that I happen to know in this case is true, I might theoretically get an even better result and a more repeatable result by using a chromatic adaptation than by using the temperature knob, by saying I'm going to counter for the fact that my source should have been 5600, but it was in fact 3200 because I left a full CTO over the source. So I'm going to compensate for that by saying, take me from 3200 to 5600. The reason that might be more accurate is that even though 5600 minus 3200 is whatever, 2400, do I know math? Yeah, 2400. That does not mean that, for example, 4200 to 6600, that I could get to that exact, I could make that adjustment using this same math, because these things don't scale linearly. So if we know information about what our source or our target is, theoretically we can get slightly more dead-on results to what we should have gotten right in camera if we know one or more of those variables and we really want to geek out. But that's kind of a tangent. And I'm trying to think in terms of other tools that we can sort of effectively recreate inside of Resolve. Those are the main ones, like the other tools. And by the way, I just released the Colloid 2.0 tools, which have kind of been overhauled. Not kind of, they have been completely overhauled. So I can demo those at some point as well. But basically, those would be the tools that you could recreate inside of Resolve. Print, can't do it. Saturation plus, again, like at its baseline level, it can apply the same type of video saturation that we have here inside of Resolve, but the entire premise of that tool was to make saturation adjustments that Resolve does not. So that's going to be different. Points, same thing. That is basically the exposure tool expressed in units of a point, which is around 1/6 of a stop, and it's applied in a way that Resolve does not work. So again, that's not something you would be able to recreate outside of this tool set. And then Contrast Plus, similar thing. At its like foundational level, it's just contrast pivot, which of course you can do inside of Resolve. But I've got a loom mix in here, which obviously we have loom mix in Resolve, but that doesn't affect the contrast knob. And being a longtime devotee of the contrast pivot, I wanted to have a loom mix that would actually affect that. You guys can see here, nothing's happening when I move that. So that's one of the things that's special about this tool. And then also the luma weighting in terms of like how we are separating out contrast from, luminance information from saturation. You're going to be stuck with this Rec 709 luma weighting inside of Resolve. If you wanted to do one of these other settings or a custom one, again, like that's part of the premise of the tool and why I bothered to develop it in the first place. So hope that's helpful stuff for how you can recreate some aspects of these tools or get a next best thing inside of Resolve.
All right. We have a ton of questions. I don't know if you want to go a little more rapid fire in the last couple minutes that we have.
Yeah, sure.
All right, cool. Well, then I'll just lob them over and hit them as fast as you can.
Yeah, serve them up.
Cool. Let's see. We've got Jim is asking, do you save color space transforms to a Powergrade or a still, or do you just build each as you go as necessary?
If I was smart, I would save them more than I do, but you can see that I have, at a minimum, my input and output transforms kind of saved off, the ones that I most commonly use, so that I can quickly tee those up without having to manually punch in all the information every time.
All right. Angad is saying he wants to understand what the difference is to outputting for some phones, which now say they support P3 color space.
Yes.
Is there a difference for exporting in Rec 7.9 to smartphone displays?
Very much so. And to make matters worse, it's different than P3 DCI, which is what we mean when we talk about theatrical deliverables, When phones say they support P3, they mean the P3 gamut with a D65 white point, which is the white point of Rec. 709, but which is not the white point of a theatrical print. That's DCI, which is significantly greener. So we can target that for sure. It's just a question of like, if I had, whatever, let's go to my Rec. 709 output here. All that would really be a matter of saying P3D65 and then selecting the gamut, which off the top of my head, I believe is a 2.2. And I don't know what the peak luma on that will be. If it supports something higher, probably not than 100 nits, or if it's paired with an HDR thing of like, oh, it should be P3D65 with like a Dolby Vision ST2084 curve that can go up to 1,000 nits or 700 or whatever. Like you would have to do the research and figure out like what the spec is. And that's a good exercise for you guys in general, just in terms of like best practices with navigating these things is just learning to ask the questions of like, oh, you want me to give you a deliverable that's going to play perfectly on your phone that supports P3? Great. You got to tell me what I'm targeting. Like what primaries and what curve am I targeting with that? And in this case, it's also important to note, is that P3 with a DCI white point or P3 with a D65 white point, because they are quite different.
All right. What's the difference between CIE 1931 and CIE 1976 in terms of color space or how to apply this knowledge?
It's an interesting question with a complicated answer that I don't even think I can probably perfectly do justice to off the top of my head. But CIE 1931 is the original color space that was devised as a way of connecting up human perception to absolute measurement of color and light. CIE 1976, if memory serves, that is the LAB color space. So it's actually a different, it has like different boundaries, but it's also a different model as well. So instead of XYZ, it is LAB, if memory serves. So there's a lot of difference there that requires probably is best explained by reading a couple chapters of, what is the book? The Color Appearance Models by Fairchild. It's complex stuff and candidly not something we should generally have to have much interaction with on a day-to-day basis when we're grading. But they're different in terms of their overall size and in terms of the model they are using as well.
Okay. Raf is asking about gate weave. I'm not sure if it's something I perceive as of today where movies are shot on film and digitized. So basically, when would you ever apply gate weave and or why?
Yeah, good question. So I'll try to answer this really briefly because I think it does bring up a really interesting like conceptual conversation, but I'll give you my answer. I would apply gate weave in a circumstance where we are really, really like forensically trying to recreate the behavior of a traditional film system, meaning captured on negative and then timed and then printed, like the whole pipeline there. I mean, even the print side, I guess, is arguable because that's only one source of gate weave. But that would be where I would do it, is like where we're like really forensically trying to nail the details. Or if we've got like an Alexa pickup shot that's going into a 35 millimeter sequence where everything else has gate weave, so I want to match it up, it would be somewhere like that. Generally speaking, like this is total artistic take and everyone's entitled to their own opinion. I have very much fallen out of love with really the errors of film systems. Like we have gate weave because no one can figure out how to make the image more stable when it's in there. And we have grain because no one can figure out how to make the image less grainy. If they had, then we wouldn't have grain. So I am of the mind that in 2021, we need to start thinking forward and stop thinking backwards about like, how can we reproduce these undesirable incidental characteristics of film, which we may identify as like, they might be sort of like kind of cheapish ways to cue like, oh, I'm in a movie. Doesn't that feel kind of nice? But I'm not actually convinced that they are, for most use cases, aesthetically superior, aesthetically desirable traits. They're just things that we sort of have a Pavlovian association with, which has its own merit, but I would rather just start pushing the envelope further and wean everybody off of expecting really beautiful images to have weave and grain innately built into them, just because we feel like that's the best way to invoke a cinematic vibe, if that makes sense.
What is the math behind the function shot match to this clip, if you know?
I actually don't know. I've like tried it out once or twice. I think it's making a very crude analysis of the overall weight and peaks of the red, green, and blue channels, and then trying to line up the analysis of shot A to the analysis of shot B. That's my understanding of it anyway. But obviously, that's a complicated like endeavor that has a lot to do with like, well, what's the color space of shot A, and is it the same as the color space of shot B, and could we put them both into linear before we make that adjustment, because that's going to get you probably better results. There's all kinds of variables in there, but my hunch from looking at it and my kind of understanding is that it's looking at the overall like sort of weight, and then also the overall like relationship of red, green, and blue in the clip to be matched, and comparing it to the clip and comparing it to the source clip, and then trying to better align those waveforms, basically.
Okay. How do you use the layer mixer with the grain on top and custom curves to determine what tonal region to add how much a certain amount of grain to?
Yeah, so that's a pretty good one to end us on for today. So let's just do a quick experiment here. Let's do some just good old regular resolve grain here. So if I do a layer mixer, and I set things up to overlay like so. So the easiest way to do that would be to do an add mode here, so that we are adding this on top of the image. And then basically, I did that pretty fast, but I'm making a layer mixer and then setting my composite mode to add. And then I'm on the top layer creating a film grain OpenFX, setting it to grain only so that I only have the card itself. And then I'm adding a second node off to the right where I'm going to sort of set my default at nothing. So like this is just essentially just that original image if my curves are behaving properly. That's actually curious. I shouldn't even be seeing that much of a difference if I'm truly adding a zeroed out curve, but maybe not something worth getting into the weeds on right now. So what you could do from here is contour your curve and just say like, oh, I want to send in some from the bottom, and like you can kind of articulate it however you wanted. And you can see the way that that's coming in like so. And maybe you could even do this with like, maybe the even better way to do this would be to add this in as a matte, essentially. This is actually an interesting question. Bear with me. Let's just see if we can do something like this. And let me set this key output gain to a normal place, like so. Yeah, so here we go. So you could basically do this slightly more complex node graph where I'm taking a separate branch off of my original base, and I've got curves going on here where I can now control, if I turn everything back on, and then let's also set our composite mode back to like overlay or something a little more predictable. And I can now sort of control, like there's my starting point. This is going to be tough stuff to see over YouTube, but if that's like a stock, like, not affecting the image at all, or actually, I guess I suppose I am. Maybe this would be, my alpha channel game is a little rusty, but I would play around with something like that. You guys have got me curious now. I'm going to play around with that, and I'll do maybe a slightly more lucid follow-up on that next week. Let's see here. I want to look at that. I'm just curious if I do this. Yeah, so this would actually be the equivalent of not having a matte built in there at all. And then you could kind of contour things around like that. And the other thing I was debating is like you might actually want to just have a pure matte of like a flat white or something like that. But you can see like this is with that matte turned off, and this is with it turned on, where I'm getting far less of it bleeding into the image except in the specific areas where I've set it up. So it would be something like that. Let me actually play around with that and maybe give you guys a slightly better answer next week. And let's if we have another quick one, Gadali, let's do one more.
Sure. Jamie Fenn here is asking about grain, having seen grain being used with sharpening in a parallel node. Do you have any thoughts around that workflow, or whether you would use sharpening or a blur or anything like that with adding grain?
You know, the only textural stuff I will do generally with grain is like in this example that we were giving. I will often blur the underlying image just a hair because theoretically nothing would be quite as sharp as the grain itself in an image like this if we were quoting film. But that's going to be a very subtle difference. Oh, and was I on? I need to go like that, I guess. Yeah. So I would just do a little bit of blurring like there. Maybe the question is about sharpening the grain itself. Like I don't see any reason why you couldn't do that, but I would ideally, I would think that the ideal would be to have a really good grain card that's of the right gauge and sampled from the right conditions and fits what I'm trying to do, that doesn't require any more like sharpening or softening or manipulation than is necessary. Wow, guys, that went by fast as always. Sorry if we didn't get to you guys today. We did get to cover a lot. So let's keep going. I think we should be able to do another one next week, and I'll keep you guys posted on my adventures with tagging and color management and proper reproduction in different browsers and software and viewing environments. And thank you as always to Gadali for co-hosting. Thanks to all you guys for joining. And if we didn't get to you today, come out for the next one, and we'll hit it on the next time we all get together. Thank you guys very much. Have an awesome week. See you for the next one.